Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Chris McCauley, Director of Compliance at ProBenefits. I'm joined today by our Customer Service Manager, John Cobble. As always, a copy of the slides and a recording of the presentation will be emailed to all participants in the next day or so. Today's session is a mini webinar, hopefully somewhere in the range of 20 minutes, and it's on flex plan administration. We're going to talk about claims adjudication, debit cards, and other common questions. So in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and just jump right into the presentation. Really, today's presentation was born out of maybe the most common and generic question that that our customer service team gets, and that's why do I have from participants, and that's why do I have to submit documentation, or why are you asking for this documentation from me? And so out of that question, we wanted to try to answer that through this presentation and hopefully give some practical tips for participants. The first thing I want to point out is just generally, there are two payment methods for FSA expenses. The first is out-of-pocket payment, which is really the most traditional method of payment. So if I have an FSA, if I have a health expense and I want to use FSA dollars to pay for that, I pay for the expense out of pocket with my own post-tax dollars, and then I submit that claim to the plan, and then the plan reimburses me out of the FSA funds. So that's the first payment method, is out of pocket. The second method is using a pre-funded flex card or debit card. This is becoming more popular, obviously, the last couple of years, but the flex card, essentially the money is already loaded onto the card for the participant, and when the participant pays using the flex card, they are actually paying with the FSA dollars. They aren't paying with their own dollars. They don't need to seek reimbursement from the plan. They are already using the FSA dollars. So with those two payment methods in mind, in terms of why we ask for documentation, the main reason is that all FSA claims must be substantiated with third-party documentation. So every single claim, whether it's out of pocket or a flex card claim, must be substantiated by a third party that details the service or product provided, the date that service was incurred, and the amount of the expense. So this information is required to ensure that the expense is actually an eligible expense, one that can be reimbursed from a health FSA. So I think it's important to note that the third-party requirement, that we can't just get documentation from the participant themselves. It must come from another individual, generally the service provider. So with that, John, I was going to pull you in and just ask a practical question. When we are looking at claims from participants, what are some of the common mistakes or common documentation that participants send in that may not meet the standards set forth here? And as a follow-up, what is an ideal documentation that should be provided for us to easily adjudicate a claim?
Thanks, Chris. A lot of times what we see most commonly is people make the assumption that we are looking for proof of payment when in fact the card transaction itself is the proof of payment. So we will get documentation like a credit card slip or a payment receipt from the provider that doesn't have the three things mentioned there. It really just shows that they made a payment on a day, which we already know from the card transaction. And then the other thing, really, most commonly a statement of service is rendered, or a detailed invoice, a billing statement. Those are usually the types of things that are going to have all the information we need from the provider, or the explanation of benefits from your insurance if it's a service filed by insurance.
Thanks, John. So yeah, just as a follow-up, we want to make sure that each of these 3 items is actually on the documentation. And as you mentioned, some of those credit card receipts don't have all 3 of the items. So we don't necessarily know it was for a medical expense. We don't know the actual date the service was incurred. We may know when they paid, but not necessarily when the service was incurred. And that's important because reimbursement of expenses is based on the date incurred. So you get reimbursed from the FSA plan year in which you incurred that FSA expense. I want to talk about some non-compliant practices that sort of cuts against this general rule that all FSA claims must be substantiated. There is no self-substantiation. Again, this deals with the third-party requirements. So the employee cannot send in their own documentation of an FSA claim, and that would not be acceptable, such as a copy, a check image, for example. So they wrote a check to the doctor, and all they do is send us an image of the check. That's not third-party substantiation. That's self-substantiation. That's specifically not permitted for FSA claim adjudication. Another thing some other administrators may do is sampling, and sampling is, again, specifically rejected by the IRS. Sampling is only asking for substantiation of a certain number of claims. For example, half of the claims they will ask, the administrator will ask for substantiation, and the other half they will simply just approve without substantiation. That sampling may be done by some other administrators, but is specifically rejected as a compliant method of claims adjudication. Similarly, de minimis thresholds, other administrators potentially could say all claims under $20 are going to be automatically approved. This is also a non-compliant way to administer claims. All claims, regardless of the amount, must be substantiated. And then finally, the plan sponsor can't just rely on an annual affidavit by the participant that says, I promise that this year I will only submit eligible FSA claims. That's simply not permitted as a method of claims adjudication. Every claim that is submitted needs to be substantiated by a third party. And the consequence of this is that any reimbursement of the plan that is using any of these methods, such as sampling or a de minimis threshold, all of the reimbursements of that plan would be taxable. Even the claims that were properly substantiated would be taxable. So essentially the plan would be wiped away and all FSA claims would be taxable. So that's why it's important to go ahead and ensure that all claims are being substantiated. So moving along to the next slide, I wanted to talk about the flex card. Because there are some nuances with the flex card. The traditional out-of-pocket claims are fairly straightforward. You pay for the claim, you send in, we don't have any idea you're paying for the claim until you send in a claim and substantiation. With flex card transactions, they too also require substantiation. So every flex card claim requires additional information or substantiation. However, some card transactions can be auto-substantiated, and that means some of these categories of flex card claims, no additional documentation needs to be provided to us. They are automatically substantiated when the participant pays for the claims. And there's a couple of categories of flex card claims that auto-substantiate. And John, I was going to go ahead and let you jump in here and maybe talk about some of those categories.
No problem, Chris. Thank you. As you'll see there, the 3 categories listed are IIAS merchants, copayments, and recurring claims. Transactions that occur at IIAS merchants are merchants that have certified that their expenses, the products that they sell or the services are eligible FSA expenses. These are typically going to be retail pharmacies like your CVS, your Walgreens, your Walmart pharmacy. And so they have certified that what you're purchasing there is either going to be eligible or not eligible, and the card will know the eligible items and go ahead and pay for those automatically. Things like prescriptions or durable medical goods like Band-Aids, those have already been substantiated by their inventory system in order to go ahead and go through. So we don't ask for documentation when you go to one of these merchants. The second category there, copayments. These are the copayments that match the insurance plan from the employer. So a lot of times one of the common questions we get is, this is my copayment, why is it not going through? And it's because it's a copayment on a spouse's insurance plan, or it's a copayment that hasn't been updated from the employer, that maybe your plan changed all your copays this year and we haven't received the update on that. And so those copayments that are on the insurance plan with your employer that we have knowledge of, those are the ones that will automatically go through. And at medical providers, you can't just pay that amount to a dentist and expect the dollar amount to go through. And then the final category, recurring claims there, we set these up for those situations where you're on a spouse's insurance plan and your copayment will always be this same amount for the medical provider. We can set that copayment as a recurring charge so that it will go through automatically for you. Most often we also do this with orthodontia. When you set up an orthodontia contract to pay your orthodontist the same amount every month, we will go ahead and set that amount up so that every time that transaction amount goes to that orthodontist, it's going to automatically pay for you and you're not going to have to provide that documentation. Chris, do you want me to go ahead and talk about the second bullet point there on the substantiation rates?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So if you look in the box there, just for some numbers, one of the common questions we get is why ProBenefits asks for so much documentation. And so we included this to give you the sort of the numbers on where that is. To simplify the numbers you see there, under the substantiation type, you'll notice that almost 75% of card transactions do automatically substantiate. So under those three categories listed above, the majority of claims are going through automatically for participants, and they're not being asked for any documentation at all. You will see the 22% there of claims that we do have to ask for documentation does tend to be the larger dollar amount. And so when you're talking to a participant, they're seeing this as, the questions are coming for the money invested, when really it's coming for the type of transaction that's happening there. But the majority of claims, and this is a slice of our year so far from January through September, the majority of claims that go through are automatically processing for folks, and they're not having to send in any documentation at all.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that point, those 75%, John, those are the claims that are falling into one of those three categories: IIAS, copayments, or recurring claims. So those 75% of the claims are falling into those categories. The reason we have to ask for documentation on the other items is because those other flex card, those 25% of the flex card swipes that don't fall into those three categories, they do require additional information to substantiate the claim. So if you have a payment to a doctor through the flex card that doesn't match your copayment, we need the additional documentation to tell us what the service was for, the date it was incurred. The flex card swipe might just tell us the date it was paid, not necessarily the date it was incurred. So those auto-substantiated claims, that 75%, those are the ones that fall into the three categories of auto-substantiation, and the rest of them are the claims that require additional information. John, maybe you can talk about just the process of flex claims. When someone swipes their flex card to pay for a claim, do they get information? Do they get an email from ProBenefits? If so, what does it tell them? If they need to send in documentation, how long do they have? That type of thing.
Yes, no problem, Chris. Whenever the card transaction is swiped, there are going to be a couple of emails that they get initially. The very first email they're going to receive is one that's required um, by card services, and that's just to tell them that a transaction has occurred, and that happens to comply with the credit card information. Whether the transaction is substantiated or not, they're going to get that immediate notification that a card transaction occurred, and that's to help prevent fraud. They can notify us right away if they didn't authorize that transaction, but that's a required email notification from the card services. The second email they're going to receive from ProBenefits is either going to tell them that this transaction was automatically substantiated and no further action is required. It's going to give them the confirmation that the claim was approved and processed through, or they're going to receive an email that indicates that this transaction could not be approved because it did not fall into one of those automatic categories. And it's going to tell them the information that was on the last slide there. It's going to say we need documentation to comply with the IRS, and that documentation needs to contain the date of service, the service provided, and the charges that are owed or charges being paid there. And so that initial email is going to tell them all of the information necessary for documentation requirements. After that initial email, the required, you're going to get into this a little bit with your remedial steps, but there's a required a request period there for submitting that documentation, and we're going to send a reminder email each week after that initial email that says, hey, we still have not received your documentation. As a reminder, this is the required information that we need, and we're going to do that 2 more times after that initial email to let them know that we're still waiting on documentation to substantiate that. And then the final email, which you'll talk about a little bit there in the remedial steps, is going to be a notice that we have had to block their card, and it will give information as to why. Sometimes we haven't been able to fully substantiate a transaction. Other times we haven't received any documentation at all, and so it's going to let them know that one of those 2 things has caused their card to be temporarily turned off until we can fully resolve this transaction. And I'll let you take back over on the remedial steps there, Chris.
Yeah, the reason we turn off the card is because of these remedial steps, which have been provided by the IRS. Essentially, the IRS says you need to take these steps in order to get substantiation or be reimbursed for ineligible claims that were paid with the Flex card. So the first 2 steps here are pretty much set in stone by the IRS. Once you provide a reasonable time, and have not received substantiation, you're essentially required by the IRS to turn the card off so that it can't be used. And participants can still submit manual claims during this time, they just can't use the card. Once the card is turned off, the plan should request repayment from the participant. Since that claim was substantiated, it technically wasn't an eligible claim, so the participant was reimbursed for that claim when they really shouldn't have been. So what they should do is repay it to the plan. The additional steps here after that to get repayment can depend on state law and some other issues. For example, sometimes employers can withhold that money from pay or offset it against future claims. And then finally, if none of these methods work, maybe the participant has terminated a year ago and you still don't have substantiation, then you essentially just treat that money as debt. But the key is you start by turning off the card and requiring repayment from the participant. Finally, on the last slide, we're bumping up on our 20 minutes, so we'll try to get through this quickly. But often the common questions we get are about specific expenses and whether they are eligible or not. Eligible health FSA expenses are defined by 213D of the IRS code, and those are expenses incurred for the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or for the purpose of affecting any structure or function of the body. That's the definition in 213D. We generally divide expenses into 3 categories. The first category is clearly medical-only expenses. For example, a heart surgery is clearly medical only. There would be no other reason to incur the expense except for a medical purpose. Those expenses are simply reimbursed with the standard documentation that we have discussed previously, with the exception that over-the-counter drugs do require a prescription. Another category of expenses are personal expenses. Those are non-medical expenses, which would obviously not be eligible for reimbursement at any time. And then finally, the most difficult category is dual purpose expenses. These are expenses that are personal sometimes or medical sometimes, depending on the participant, depending on why they're incurring the expense. And so dual purpose expenses not only require the standard documentation, but normally require an additional level of documentation, a letter of medical necessity from a doctor saying that they are being incurred for a medical purpose. And so just finally, maybe John, we can quickly run through some of these difficult expenses. These are probably the most common questions we get, or the most common expenses that the customer service team comes to compliance and says, you know, are these eligible? Not all of them, but some of them are, most of them are dual purpose items. Sometimes they could be personal, sometimes they could be medical. John, maybe you want to talk about supplements real quick?
Yes, no problem, Chris. Typically supplements and vitamins, these are things that, you know, it could be everything from your Flintstone multivitamin to a specific, you know, high capacity probiotic, or like a mega oil, something like that. And it depends on why you're taking it. If you just take the, you know, a 1-a-day multivitamin because you don't eat your vegetables and need to get some additional supplement, that's going to be a personal use for that. But if your doctor has specifically said, you know, you have low vitamin D and you need to take a supplement for that, then that's going to make it a medical purpose, and it's going to change the classification of that. But we need to have that letter on file in order to be able to approve that as a medical purpose. Similarly, we had talked about, Chris, with personal care items like toothpaste, mouthwash, toothbrushes, deodorant, things like that are not are going to be daily use personal items and are not going to be specifically for any medical purpose. So those are typically not ever going to be eligible because of that. But the other things like supplements and vitamins may find their medical purpose.
Yes, there's a distinction between expenses that are for medical care and expenses that are for general health. And so toothpaste, toothbrushes, those are the types of items that generally fall into that general health category that are not eligible. I'll go through a couple of these expenses. Food, as distinguished from supplements, food is generally not eligible, even if you have a medical condition and are required to eat a certain type of food. The reason for that is it's often considered a substitute for normal food that you would be eating anyways. So if you would be incurring the expense anyways, even without the medical condition, then it's potentially not eligible. So food is one of those items that you would be incurring the expense whether you needed the special food or you ate regular food. So because it's a substitute, it's generally not eligible. I think clothes is another example of a substitute. Sometimes individuals with back issues are required to wear certain shirts or certain clothes, and generally those aren't eligible because they're just substitute for other expenses. Capital expenditures, which are essentially improvements to your home, such as elevators or ramps, are potentially eligible if there's a medical purpose, but generally they are only eligible to the extent they don't improve your property value. So if the capital expenditure does increase your property value, generally it's not eligible. Mattresses can be eligible generally, since it's also a substitute for a normal mattress. Generally, if you have a letter of medical necessity, the amount you are spending on a special mattress, the excess cost over a normal mattress, that would be the only eligible portion. John, you want to talk about glasses and frames quickly?
Yes, no problem. With glasses and frames, the thing that we often run into is because the prescription for glasses has to be eligible, but a lot of things we see recently are online orders for frames, which don't necessarily include the prescription information. We know that you're getting the frames for glasses, but with certain websites, you can order like 5 sets of frames and send 4 of them back. And so without that prescription information, that the frame itself is not eligible, and so we need to see that, and that's one of the things we often come across is not getting the 2 of those pieces of information paired together. Similarly, surprisingly enough with orthodontia, is because that requires a contract, we can often see that there's an expense that's associated with orthodontia, but if we don't have that contract on file that tells us how long the service is actually going to go, then we don't know that that particular expense is eligible in this plan year because we don't know the service period for that. And on our website, there's a great piece of information that explains a lot more detail about orthodontia, because we do get a lot of frequent questions about that, and I don't have time to go through those questions right here, but it lays out the 3 common methods for orthodontia reimbursement that is a great resource we point participants to find the information they need for that particular type of expense. Chris.
Thanks, John. I'll just wrap up the last 2 quickly. Weight loss expenses such as gym memberships or fitness classes, those are obviously dual purpose. Even if you don't have a medical condition, you might enroll, but they potentially can be eligible with a letter of medical necessity if you do in fact have a medical condition and you are recommended to incur those expenses by a doctor. And then finally, concierge or VIP programs, which are becoming more common among doctors who will charge essentially a couple $100s for access. These are generally not eligible expenses because all they are providing is access to the doctor throughout the year, and they don't relate specifically to a service that is being provided. They only relate to access. So those are just a couple of difficult expenses. We wanted to talk briefly, practically on this presentation about FSA claims adjudication and some difficult expenses. So again, John, thanks for joining us today. We're going to have our next webinar presentation in October, which is going to be an attendee choice webinar. So we're going to send out an email that you can look for in the next week or 2 with some potential presentation topics, and we're going to take a survey, and the highest presentation topic winner will be presented in October. But again, thanks for joining us, and we hope you have a good day.